Prince of Persia is a trilogy that, when you step back and look at it as a whole, revolves around one very simple idea. A man makes a mistake and then spends 3 entire games trying to undo it. The Sands of Time is the moment where that mistake happens. Warrior Within is the moment where the prince refuses to accept the consequences of it. And the Two Thrones is the moment where he finally learns that some things cannot be undone. What makes my experience with the trilogy a little unusual is that I actually didn't start at the beginning. The Two Thrones was the first game in the trilogy that I ever played, which, looking back now, is a very strange place to start. Instead of watching the prince make his mistakes and slowly try to fix them, I jumped straight into the part of the story where everything had already gone wrong and he was already dealing with the aftermath. At the same time though, I didn't think about trilogies or story structure. I just installed whatever games looked interesting and started playing. Only later did I realize that I had accidentally experienced the entire story backwards. First the ending, then the middle, and only after that the beginning. And somehow, even in that completely wrong order, the trilogy still worked. Recently I replayed The Two Thrones again from start to finish, and what surprised me the most wasn't that the game felt smaller than I remembered. In fact, the opposite happened. There was far more platforming than I remembered, far more vertical movement through Babylon, and a lot more gameplay variety spread across the different sections of the city. But more importantly, replaying it now with the entire trilogy in mind makes the story feel much clearer, because The Two Thrones isn't trying to escalate the conflict endlessly like many sequels do. Instead, it does something more interesting. It ends it. The Two Thrones begins immediately after the events of Warrior Within, where the prince believes he has finally escaped the fate that has been chasing him for years. After traveling to the Island of Time, fighting through an entire fortress built around the creation of the sands, and ultimately interfering with the timeline itself, he returns to Babylon believing that the nightmare is finally over. But the moment he arrives, that illusion disappears. Babylon is already under attack. The city is burning, soldiers are fighting in the streets, towers collapse in the distance as invading armies move deeper into the capital. Instead of returning home to peace, the prince arrives just in time to watch everything fall apart. What makes this setting so effective is how alive Babylon feels compared to the Island of Time from Warrior Within. The Island of Time was an incredible location, but it was also isolated. You were exploring a fortress that existed outside the normal flow of history, surrounded by ancient machinery and empty halls that felt abandoned long ago. Babylon is the opposite. Even though the game is still quite structured and linear in how it moves you through the city, the environment constantly feels alive around you. Battles happen in the distance while you climb across rooftops. Soldiers move through streets you never actually reach, and entire parts of the city appear beyond the path you're currently navigating. The game constantly reminds you that the chaos isn't just happening where the prince is standing. It's happening everywhere. And one detail I always loved is how the game constantly shows you where you're going. Throughout large portions of the story, you can see the massive Tower of Babylon rising in the distance. At first, it feels impossibly far away, but slowly as the story progresses, you begin climbing towards it. The whole game becomes a gradual ascent through the city, not just physically but narratively as well. Because the closer the prince gets to the center of Babylon, the closer he gets to confronting everything he tried to escape. Across the trilogy, the prince changes dramatically as a character. In the Sands of Time, he begins as a young and somewhat arrogant hero, someone who wants recognition and glory more than anything else. His mistake comes not from cruelty or ambition, but from impatience and pride. He wants to prove himself. In Warrior Within, that same prince becomes something very different. Instead of arrogance, we see anger and desperation. The Dahaka hunts him relentlessly, and the entire game feels like a man trying to outrun something inevitable. He refuses to accept that his actions might have permanent consequences. But when The Two Thrones begins, something shifts again. The prince isn't calm exactly, but he's different. He sounds tired. There's frustration in his voice, but it's no longer the explosive anger that defined Warrior Within. Instead, it feels more like exhaustion, like someone who has already fought the same battle too many times and is slowly realizing that the fight might never truly end. He already traveled across time trying to undo his mistake. He already tried to prevent the sands from ever being created. And now he returns home only to realize that the consequences followed him anyway. One of the most interesting mechanics introduced in the Two Thrones is the Dark Prince. After the sands are released once again during the attack on Babylon, the prince becomes partially corrupted. Instead of turning him into one of the sand creatures we saw in the previous games, the corruption manifests in a much more interesting way. The Dark Prince becomes a voice inside his head. Throughout the game, the darker version constantly mocks him, questions his decisions, and pushes him towards more aggressive solutions. When I first played the game years ago, I mostly saw him as an edgy narrator designed to add drama to the story, but replaying it now makes his role much clearer. The Dark Prince represents everything the prince has been carrying since the beginning of the trilogy. The anger, the frustration, the part of him that still believes he should fight fate instead of accepting it. And the gameplay reflects that conflict surprisingly well. When you play as the normal prince, you can approach situations carefully. You can use stealth mechanics like speed kills, observe enemy patrols, and eliminate enemies quietly before they even notice you. But when the prince transforms into the Dark Prince, everything changes. Your health begins draining constantly. The only way to survive is by killing enemies or destroying objects to collect sands and restore your health. Suddenly, patience disappears. You're encouraged to attack, to move aggressively, and to eliminate enemies as quickly as possible. One of the best examples of this mechanic happens later in the story, when the prince falls into a dry well while transformed into the Dark Prince. There's no water, which means there's no way to return to normal. Your health continues draining while the Dark Prince mocks you about thirst and desperation, and suddenly every enemy you encounter becomes something you actually want to see, because killing them restores your health. You become greedy for violence, and it's one of the cleverest ways the game communicates exactly what the Dark Prince represents. Another thing that stood out during my replay was just how vertical the game feels. You begin in the lower parts of Babylon, moving through streets and sewers while the invasion spreads around you. But slowly the game pushes you higher. You climb rooftops, you navigate palace balconies, you swing across towers overlooking massive sections of the city. Every once in a while, the game gives you a moment where you can stop and look back, realizing just how far you've climbed. The city slowly unfolds beneath you. Along the way, the game mixes different types of gameplay surprisingly well. There are chaotic chariot sequences where everything suddenly speeds up. There's the section where you ride a massive stone golem through the hanging gardens. There are stealth encounters, arena fights, and long platforming climbs that push the prince's acrobatics to their limits. And near the end of the game, one moment changes the tone completely. You discover your father's corpse, and beside him, his sword. Up until that moment, combat still feels balanced. Enemies take effort to defeat, and most fights involve combos, timing, and quick-time events. But the moment the prince picks up his father's sword, everything changes. Enemies that once required long fights suddenly die in a single hit. It becomes a pure power trip. After chasing the Vizier across Babylon for the entire game, suddenly nothing stands between you and him anymore. And it perfectly reflects the prince's emotional state at the moment. He isn't calm, he isn't reflective, he's furious. One of the most interesting narrative elements in The Two Thrones is the return of Farah. If you played The Sands of Time, Farah was one of the central characters in that story. She fought alongside the prince while they tried to undo the disaster he caused. But because the prince rewound time at the end of that game, everything that happened between them technically never occurred. When Farah appears again in The Two Thrones, she doesn't recognize him. For the prince, that moment is incredibly strange. He remembers everything that happened between them. But for her, those memories simply don't exist. The game doesn't treat this purely as nostalgia. Instead, it becomes a reminder of the consequences of changing time. The prince erased the disaster, but he also erased the relationship that formed during it. Eventually, the prince reaches the final confrontation with the Vizier. The boss fight itself moves through multiple phases as the prince climbs the tower and weakens him step by step. But defeating the Vizier isn't the true ending of the story. The real final enemy appears immediately afterward, the Dark Prince. Instead of another traditional boss fight, the final confrontation takes place entirely inside the prince's mind. You chase the Dark Prince through a strange internal landscape while fragments of locations from previous games appear around you. Bridges from the Sands of Time, structures from Warrior Within. The prince is literally moving through his own past. And the resolution is surprisingly simple. The Dark Prince suggests going back to the Island of Time again, reversing everything once more, saving the prince's father, fixing the past. But for the first time in the entire trilogy, the prince refuses. No more turning back time. He finally accepts what happened. Looking at the trilogy as a whole, the structure becomes surprisingly clear. The Sands of Time is about making a mistake. Warrior Within is about refusing to accept it. And The Two Thrones is about finally learning to live with it. That progression is what makes the trilogy feel cohesive even today. If Warrior Within is the most ambitious entry in the series, experimenting with darker tone and complex time mechanics, then The Two Thrones is the perfect conclusion, the final piece that brings everything together. If you played The Two Thrones, I'd be curious to hear how you remember it. Was it your favorite in the trilogy, or did one of the other games stand out more to you? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the revisit, I also covered the other games, and I will be covering the entire trilogy as a whole in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.